Welcome to the Virtual Pathfinder channel. This is a review of the Samyang 7.5mm F3.5 lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras. We will take a closer look at all important aspects of this lens. If you're interested in photography, lenses and camera equipment, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I'm interested to hear your opinion about this lens. Please write what you think about it in the comment section below. Samyang Optics is a South Korean manufacturer of camera lenses for several camera standards. It was founded in 1972 and has 150 employees according to Wikipedia. Their products are sold under various brand names. For instance, Samyang, Rokinon, Bauer, Optica, Vivitar, to name a few. Their lenses often seem to be designed for one standard, which is then adapted to other types of mounts. I think they have a smart business strategy, making each lens design compete on various standards, such as full frame 4/3, APS-C, micro 4/3, etc. My impression of the Samyang lenses is that they're very nice to use, although sometimes it feels like the specification is a bit stretched far when it comes to the micro 4/3 cameras. The smaller micro 4/3 sensor magnifies optical defects by a crop factor of 2 compared to a full frame sensor. What looks sharp on a full frame sensor may appear slightly soft on a micro 4/3 sensor. With that in mind, I still find my Samyang lenses very nice to use. Like most Samyang lenses, the lens in this review is fully manual, which means manual focusing and aperture setting. As always, that requires some use of focus peaking or finder magnification. I will get back to this issue later in the review. The focal length is 7.5mm, which is equivalent to 15mm focal length for a full frame camera. That makes it a fisheye lens. It can be used for wide-angle photography, such as panorama. The maximum aperture is F3.5, which is not very bright, but it's okay. It produces images with about 180 degrees angle. If your finger is sticking out when you hold the camera, it may appear in the image. You may aim the camera away from people and still have them in the image, but usually they become very small and a bit distorted. The images have a huge amount of distortion, which may bend straight lines in various directions depending on where the lens is aiming. Straight lines through the center of the images remain straight, while off-axis lines become bent by barrel distortion. That can be corrected in post-processing. This is a very special kind of lens, and although it's cheap compared to other fisheye lenses, one should ask oneself for what purpose this lens will be used before considering buying it. In many cases there are alternatives, but there are a few situations where this kind of lens is necessary. First I will look at the physical characteristics of the lens, then the specified optics and functionality, before moving on to various aspects of image quality. Finally, I will present my conclusions about the lens, with some comments on how to use it and what kind of photography it's good for. Let's start with the physical characteristics of the lens. I measure the weight to be about 171 grams without caps on my scale. The specified weight is 197 grams. It has a diameter of about 60 millimeters and a length about 48 millimeters, which is very compact. There is no filter thread, and there is a kind of mini lens hood built in the lens. There is an aperture ring with distinct clicks for each setting. It feels good to use it. It also has a focus ring with a distance scale on the lens, which is good since it is a manual focus lens. The focus ring has the right resistance and feels nice to use. The lens has a few plastic parts but feels solid and like a quality product. The caps and lens hood are made of plastic, but also has a quality feel. The overall impression is that it's a quality lens. The lens is not weather sealed. If you intend to use it outdoors in bad weather, then that needs to be considered. The focal length is 7.5 mm as previously mentioned. That corresponds to a 15 mm lens for a full frame camera, which makes it a fisheye lens. It has an aperture setting between f3.5 and f22. The aperture has 6 diaphragm blades. The closest focus is 0.09 meters, which is close, but not macro due to the wide angle. The lens has no support for autofocus or aperture control from the camera. There is no image stabilization in the lens. I use Olympus cameras which have image stabilization in the camera body, but if you use a different camera brand with no image stabilization in the camera body, that may be good to know. The lens does not communicate EXIF data to the camera. In other words, the focal length and aperture setting for each shot is not saved to the image files. I have shot photos of a test pattern using various apertures to check if there's vignetting or distortion in the images. The resulting images show an extreme barrel distortion as well as a certain amount of vignetting. As mentioned, straight lines through the center of the image remain straight, while lines that passes beside the center get bent out from the optical axis. However, both the distortion and vignetting can be corrected in post-processing, but that requires the software and a bit of effort. It is not difficult though. I may do another video to show how to do it in Affinity Photo for iPad. When looking at the center and edges of the test image, it's possible to see the sharpness for the different aperture settings. Overall, I find this lens to be sharp at the center even for the largest aperture f3.5, and the edges are very sharp from f5.6 and on. There is a certain amount of diffraction for smaller apertures, which can be seen as a star pattern around light sources such as sun at daytime or street lights at night. My opinion is that it actually looks good in the images, so I don't see that as a problem. The contrast and color rendering is quite good in the images. It is sometimes hard to find the best exposure for the images since the wide angle tends to include lots of bright and dark areas. If one area is correctly exposed, another may be over or underexposed. My advice is to slightly underexpose the image to preserve as many nuances as possible and then correct it in post-processing, where masks can be used if necessary. There is a tiny amount of chromatic aberration, which is hardly noticeable, mainly for the largest aperture. When looking at flare in daylight, mainly when shooting against the sun, there is a very limited amount of flare. I would say it's well controlled. As mentioned before, there is often a diffraction star making the sun look more interesting, especially for smaller apertures. The same goes for light sources at night. The maximum aperture is quite small and it's an extremely wide angle, so it is difficult to get any out of focus blur when using this lens. Things out of focus don't blur out much. The typical use for this kind of lens is art photography using the extreme lens distortion, panorama photography where distortion is either not corrected or corrected in post-processing. It can typically be landscapes or interior architecture. Action photography using small apertures with large depth of field where almost everything is in focus. Then manual focus is no problem. It should also be good for wide field astrophotography. I have to admit I haven't tried this lens for this purpose. My astrophotography is usually limited to long focal length through telescopes. I may try this lens for wide field astrophotography in a future video. There are different ways to do that. For instance, very long exposures to create circular star trails, or semi-long exposure times for capturing stars in the whole sky, or long exposures using a star tracker, making it possible to do sharp images with long exposures. Here are my conclusions about this lens. I summarize the negative and the positive. First, the negative. The lens is fully manual with no autofocus or aperture setting from the camera body. It has no image stabilization. The EXIF data is not transferred to the camera. The images are very distorted and has vignetting. It is not weather sealed, and it's hard to get exposure right over the whole image due to the wide angle. The positive. The lens has a quality feel. Images look interesting. It captures wide angles in a single shot. Distortion and vignetting can be corrected to a large extent in post-processing. The price of this lens is very attractive compared to other fisheye lenses. This lens is not suitable for documentary photography due to the distortion. Art photography is maybe the main area. Action photography is possible since extreme wide angle is less sensitive to shake. But at the same time, the apertures used must be small enough to get lots of depth of field, since this is a manual lens. If you look at the price-performance ratio, this lens has an attractive price compared to other fisheye lenses, and the performance of it is good. So if a fisheye lens is required, this is a very good choice. However, I would like to throw a caveat. This focal length is very unusual due to the very distorted images. It is not a lens to be used very often. When looking at a few photos, it can be very interesting, but if there are lots of images, it's a bit tiring to see the same kind of distortion effect. Although fisheye can be interesting, it is kind of a one-trick pony. Of course, it's possible to defish and correct the distortion in post-processing, but then the images will lose pixel resolution when it's cropped back to rectangular shape. There is of course margin for that, since the original image usually has about 16 to 20 megapixels. If extreme wide angle is the reason for buying this lens, I think one should also consider other alternatives, which I will get back to in a minute. There are a few things a fisheye lens can do which is difficult to achieve in other ways. One such thing is wide-field astrophotography. Another is wide-angle action photography. My experience of this lens is that I like it, but at the same time I use it very seldom. Therefore, I think it's not a high-priority lens to buy. It is a lens to buy when you already have all the essential lenses, such as more typical wide-angle lenses, portrait lenses, and some telephoto lenses. The value for money should be calculated as something like price per hours used per year. Then the usage-based price for two lenses may be the same, even if one has the double price, since it may be used twice as often. With that calculation, this lens is not cheap compared to the most commonly used lenses. In conclusion, if you already have all the focal length you need and you want to add a spice to your camera bag, then this may be an interesting option. The price in the year 2020 is about $220 or euros. Let's have a quick look at the alternatives. The first alternative is to use a smartphone with panorama recording. By doing so, you can get a 180 to 360 degree image without distortion. Another alternative is to put a camera on a tripod and then use a 17mm wide-angle lens and shoot several images, which then can be stitched together in post-processing to create a wide-angle shot which has the same pixel density as the ordinary images. Then we have other fisheye lenses such as the Olympus 8mm f1.8 lens, but that cost $900. It is fully automatic and high performance lens, and it has f1.8. It weighs 315 grams and is 80mm long. Another fisheye lens is the Panasonic Lumix 8mm f3.5, but that cost $800. It's of course fully automatic, it's a high performance lens, and it has about the same size and weight as the lens in this review. As a last alternative, I will mention that Olympus has a body cap fisheye 9mm f8 lens. This is not a full-fledged lens, but as close as you can get, and it's extremely light and small, about the size of a lens cap, and the focal length is not really fisheye, but not far from it. The price is less than half compared to this lens, but it's not really a high performer. On the other hand, it fits in a shirt pocket easily. It almost disappears. So this is a lens that will come along in the camera bag without taking any space or adding any weight. The price is lower at $99 US, although it is simpler in functionality and specification. On the other hand, this lens will probably come along more often and may therefore be used a lot more, which then would bring down the price per usage, which I mentioned earlier, from the already lower price. But then again, this is not a real lens, it's kind of a different animal. Still, it's worth considering for some situations. I will make a separate review of this one later. Considering what it is, I can't say it's cheap, but it's interesting. So finally, is this lens good value for the money? My conclusion is this lens is good value if you really need a fisheye lens. The key question is whether you need the focal length or not. In many cases you may be able to do extreme wide-angle photography using either panorama recording function in a smartphone or by stitching together common wide-angle photos. For instance, multiple shots at 17mm focal length using a tripod. In those cases, there is typically no need for correction of distortion. My experience is that although I like a fisheye lens, I don't use it very often, perhaps for 1% of all my photography. I hope this was useful information for you. If you find this video interesting, please like and subscribe. I will soon make a review of the Olympus Fisheye Body Cap 9mm f8 lens. And I will also make a video about defishing fisheye photos, which means correcting the image distortion in fisheye images. Until then, I hope you have a nice week. Stay safe.